When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary to conclude a run of episodes, a decent respect to the opinions of the viewers requires that I should release my recap video for the Emancipation Trilogy, where I talk about things I left out of the videos, correct mistakes that I made in the videos, and answer questions from Gaon and Navi level patrons on Patreon. Before going ahead with the recap, I want to let everyone know that I'm taking March off. Maintaining this channel is a full-time job, and as the amount of time and energy needed to make these videos as good as they can be has only gone up, working non-stop for 2 years has had a negative effect on both my mental and physical health. For a long time that wasn't as much of an issue because the channel was running at a loss and I had nothing to lose because there was a pandemic and there was nothing else to do. But now that I am able to make a living off this channel, it's now possible for me to take time off, and I think everybody should be able to do that. So there will not be any regular videos here in March. Don't take that to mean that I'll be completely gone, but I will be doing other things. In fact, I'm probably going to take a few breaks throughout this year to work with others, to spend more time with my friends and family, and to develop other creative projects. So this is sort of a correction, sort of an elaboration. As the Habsburg Empire was not a unified country, at least not yet, the Josephine Reforms had to be implemented separately in each individual state. This is partly why Jewish emancipation took years and years to implement within that political structure. And there was one significant area of the empire where it was never implemented, and that was the Austrian Netherlands, comprising most of what is now Belgium and Luxembourg. Prior to the War of Spanish Succession, which happened at the beginning of that century, the Austrian Netherlands had been the Spanish Netherlands. It had been part of the Spanish Empire, and thus it was an area where Jews were not allowed to live. And having come out of that legacy, the collection of local lords who ruled over this territory protested to Joseph II not to emancipate the Jews under the threat of rebellion, and he gave in. While Belgium did eventually become an independent country in 1830 and immediately implemented Jewish emancipation, I do think it's notable that despite being surrounded by countries with very large Jewish populations, Belgium did not have a Jewish population of any great size until the 20th century. Navi-level patron Jay Fleischman asks, in your earlier videos, the primary driver of European Jewish freedoms was often the political advantage for those in power, e.g. the economic stimulation of importing Jews into Norman England, cash grabs from canceling Jewish debts and seizing their assets during expulsions, etc. Apart from the emergence of Enlightenment ideals which argued for the universal rights of men, were there any changes in political power during the late 1700s which made it convenient to grant increased liberties to Jews at a scale not previously seen? Changes in political power? No. Changes in economic power? Yes. Starting in the 17th century, Western Europe was beginning to transition from feudalism to mercantilism and then to capitalism. In the 17th century, this was mostly limited to things like legalizing banks and decoupling monetary policy from religion, but in the late 18th century, as the Industrial Revolution began, there started to be an incentive for governments to have a large workforce that was not legally restricted from participating in the industrial economy, either because they were serfs who were tied to the land, or in the case of the Jews, particularly in the most extreme cases like Alsace, they were forbidden from having normal jobs altogether. In the age of feudalism, when being tied to the land was the default, there was an economic value in having Jews as a class of people who weren't tied down and who could engage in commerce and trade. But once commerce and trade became the norm, having Jews as a separate estate of the realm went from being an asset to economic growth to an impediment. That isn't to say that this happened overnight. For one, mercantilism, which is the belief that all nations should be economically self-sufficient and in a constant state of economic warfare, continued to dominate for a long time, and to an extent it's still out there. Of course, religious and racial prejudices very much continued, and in some countries like Britain, Jewish emancipation wasn't tied to the economy to begin with, which is one of the things that made emancipation in Britain much more difficult. But I'm not going to get too much into that for now. So yeah, industrialization. So, fellow YouTuber The Aztlan Historian has alerted me to the fact that the first synagogue in North America was not Shearit Yisrael in New York, but in fact, Mikveh Yisrael Emmanuel on the island of Curaçao in the Dutch Antilles, which was founded in 1651. Chalk this up to pure oversight. As it happens, the Jewish population of the Caribbean outnumbered that of the 13 colonies right up to the time of independence, mainly on Curaçao, Jamaica, and St. Thomas, and I really underestimated both their numbers and their significance. Another minor correction: Yorktown was not the final land battle of the American Revolution. Leaving aside proxy conflicts like those in India, there were a couple of small battles fought in an attempt to drive the British out of Georgia and South Carolina. But they were all conclusive British victories, and it didn't matter anyway, because by this time the war was already effectively over. Another minor correction: I made a little bit of a Freudian slip and said that the majority of Rhode Island's Jews who left America because they had sided with the British included Judah Touro rather than the leader of the congregation, Isaac Touro. Judah Touro was Isaac's son, and he was a child at the time. And ironically, when Isaac died almost immediately after fleeing the US, the family just moved right back. I'm not sure whether he'll come up in any future videos, but Judah Touro did become quite a big deal in his own right, and in fact, he had an uncredited cameo in my video about Jews in China. Now, this video is my most successful video thus far, and understandably so, as it's my first foray into American history. But when this video came out, I saw a lot of comments by people taken aback at the fact that they'd never previously learned about early Jewish American history, to a degree that seemed almost political or moral, and wanting to know why early American Jewish history isn't better known. So there are two ways to answer this question. One from the perspective of American history, and one from the perspective of Jewish history. In the context of American history, Jews were just a tiny, tiny minority. There are many stories of similarly small groups in colonial and revolutionary America, and I hope, that this episode encourages more people to look into their own community's relationship with early America. On that note, being a channel about Jewish history, I'm necessarily going to cover very well-known historical periods and events from a perspective that isn't very well known. That's partly why I started this channel in the first place. I think Jewish history should be accessible in its own right, rather than just being an accessory to the histories of other cultures. But even by that standard, I don't think it's strange or wrong for people not to be aware of this particular era and place in Jewish history, because, like I said in the video, Jews in the US were a very small minority. Even in Charleston, which had the largest Jewish population of any city in the 1790 census, Jews were still less than 4% of the population, and only 7% of the non-enslaved population. So while I think this is an interesting subject, I don't think it's a catastrophic failure of the American educational system that you didn't learn about it in school. I saw a lot of people fretting over that in the comments, and I wanted to put them at ease. In the context of Jewish history, the population thing also kind of applies. Around the time of the Revolution, the world's Jewish population was somewhere in the range of 2.5 million, of whom only 2,000 lived in the US. But aside from that, there's also a problem of historical bias, because the study of Jewish American history prior to the 1880s was seen until very recently, like the last 20 years, as kind of a joke, or at least something not of great import in the greater scheme of American Jewish history. This is because since independence there have been, I'd say, 4 waves of Jewish immigration to the US. And the vast, vast majority of American Jews, including me, can trace most or all of their ancestry to the third of those waves, which took place between 1884 and 1914 during what has commonly become known as the open door policy. That wave of immigration outnumbered many times over the Jewish population already living in the US at the time, and they were really responsible for creating, for the first time, a distinct Jewish American culture that was both distinct from American culture at large and also not hyper-localized. However, thanks mostly to the work of Jonathan Sarna, whose book American Judaism was my main source for this video, we can recognize now that this early period had a huge influence in terms of the way Jewish communities in America organize themselves. That is, not only to be emancipated, but for every congregation to be its own supreme authority rather than the subject of a much larger rabbinate or other court system. And this is a direct consequence of the fact that there were no rabbis in America during this early period. And there's also just an argument to cover it in the name of completeness. The United States, from the 1920s right up to the 2010s, had the largest Jewish population of any country in the world. And at no point between that and this earlier period was the Jewish presence absent. Demographic changes or no, it is a continuous history, so it only makes sense to start at the beginning. Another recurring theme in the response to this video was a general frustration over the lack of mention of a large population of crypto-Jews, or at least Europeans of Jewish descent, in Spanish and Portuguese America. Now, this is a topic that has become very trendy in recent decades, without a lot of nuanced understanding. So I spoke to Jarrett Ross, the Genie vlogger, about this, and he explained to me the degree to which this subject has been inflated and mythologized. First of all, we need to distinguish between people of Jewish descent, Conversos, and crypto-Jews. These three terms all have very subtle but very meaningfully different definitions. Starting with people of Jewish descent. It is absolutely true that most people in Latin America today have some Jewish ancestry. However, the reason for that is because most people in Europe, even during the period of colonization, also had some Jewish ancestry, owing mainly just to the amount of time that had passed, much in the same way that most people in Europe today are descended from Charlemagne. Now, with Conversos, that is to say, Jews and descendants of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula who converted to Christianity in the 15th century, by and large, Conversos constituted a class of people who were explicitly forbidden from settling in the New World without explicit royal permission on an individual basis. So they were rare, but we do have records of people like that who did settle in the New World. Probably the most famous is Luis de Carvajal y de la Cueva. However, only a tiny fraction of Conversos, in the case of Spain, were crypto-Jews, i.e., people who remained faithful to Judaism in secret. You have to remember that unlike in Portugal, where the Jews were all forcibly converted, the Jews of Spain were given the choice to convert or leave. So while crypto-Judaism was not unheard of in Spain, it was fairly rare even among Conversos, at least when compared to Portugal. Furthermore, if you were a crypto-Jew looking for passage out of Spain in order to practice Judaism openly, New Spain would be just about your worst option. Not only was the Spanish Inquisition in full effect in the colonies, but they were specifically looking for people like that. Even in cases where someone in New Spain was accused of crypto-Judaism, like Carvajal, they were usually acquitted or no judgment was made. And really, why would you go across the ocean to undergo that kind of scrutiny when you could go to Tuscany or the Netherlands or even just hop the border into France, as many did, because those were places that were easy to get to and where Jews could live openly. So the reason people think there was a large crypto-Jewish population in Latin America can largely be attributed to a historian named Stanley Hortus, who in the 1980s was the official historian of the US state of New Mexico, and went on to specialize in studies of American crypto-Judaism until 2005, when he published To the End of the Earth, which articulated this idea of a large crypto-Jewish exodus to, very conveniently, his own state of New Mexico. Hortus has come under a lot of criticism for his methodology, mainly by Dr. Judith Neulander, who points out that Hortus bases his theory mainly on the preservation of folk traditions in New Mexico that may have been Jewish in origin, but had, by the time of colonization, become totally mainstream in Spanish society. Max Miller actually put out an excellent video recently which connects to this very topic, in which he points out that many of the signs of crypto-Judaism targeted by the Inquisition, and thus cited as proof of crypto-Judaism, were incredibly mundane, like lighting candles on Friday night in a time when everybody lit candles every night. That said, people are very defensive about this, because the mythologizing of Jewish origins by people like Hortus have fed into these grand familial and even in certain cases nationalistic narratives, to the point where Dr. Neulander routinely receives death threats for her criticisms. But that's where we are. Do most people in Latin America have Jewish ancestry? Yes. Were there settlers of Jewish birth or who had parents of Jewish birth in New Spain? Yes, but not many. Did they continue to practice Judaism in secret for the next 5 centuries? Almost certainly not. The number of verified examples of crypto-Jews in Latin America can be counted on one hand. And to a man, they were not people who stuck around in that part of the world. Gaon-level patron Learnabit asks, throughout the 13 colonies period, the South, and Charleston in particular, appear set to become major centers of Jewish life in the new United States. What factors diminished the roles of the South and Charleston in Jewish life? And what kept larger waves of later Jewish immigrants from choosing this region? So, one of the things I took away from researching for this video is that, especially prior to that big wave of immigration at the turn of the 20th century, pretty much everything that happened in American history was also happening within the Jewish American community. So the reason that the South stagnated as a center of Jewish population is because it stagnated as a center of population in general. It's as simple as that. As I said in the answer to Jay's question, this period of history was also the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the American South, which had a massive surplus of labor due to slavery, was able to remain a predominantly agrarian society, whereas the North industrialized. And that created a huge demand for labor that was filled by immigrants. The only major city in the American South was New Orleans, which did profit from industrialization and did attract immigrants, but it was a complete anomaly within the Southern context. At the time of American independence, both the Jewish population and the overall population were about evenly split between what we now think of as the North and South. This is actually one of the reasons why Washington, D.C. was chosen as the site of the capital. It was right at the median center of population. But by the time of the American Civil War, 85 years later, the population of the North outnumbered that of the South by more than 2 to 1, and the numbers for Jews were actually a little bit more skewed in favor of the North. And that's going to become relevant when we cover the American Civil War. Just you wait. Navi-level patron Oshar Gordon asks, it sounds like these episodes are leading to the conclusion that the only industrialized society where Jews have not yet been emancipated, or where Jews are still compelled to abide by the rulings of religious courts, is the State of Israel. Although I suppose it's fair to say that, as a democratic country with a Jewish majority, the compulsion is by the Jewish majority. I can understand why it might seem that way, and speaking as an Israeli, it certainly feels that way at times. But in truth, Jews in Israel are emancipated. To a very large degree, the Israeli legal system is descended from the legal system of the Ottoman Empire, which did emancipate its Jews in 1839, and that will get its own video in the near future. However, unlike in France or the United States, or eventually most of the world, the Ottomans never coupled this with the introduction of a secular civil law code for marriage and divorce. The millet system, which relegated matters of personal law to religious authorities and tied religious communities to those authorities, persisted. And in most of West Asia, including Israel, it continues to persist. The irony of that is that not only did the Jewish majority in Israel not consent to abide by the millet system, but in fact, most Israeli Jews are vehemently opposed to it. This is a country in which the overwhelming majority of people are not religious, and that was equally true at the time of independence in 1948. The millet system has survived as a result of repeated compromises between secular and religious political parties to form coalition governments. And once upon a time, that wasn't as big of a deal as it is now. What's changed, and I've gone into this quite a bit more on my second channel, Elections Israel, is that 1, it's become untenable on principle to uphold this system because it doesn't allow for gay marriage. And 2, it's become an impediment even for straight couples because of the way by which the rabbinate has been captured by the ultra-Orthodox and centralized into a massive ideologically driven bureaucracy without any real government oversight thanks to the presence of friendly political parties. But other than that, Israelis are emancipated. They can't arrest you for violating Shabbat or anything. And that is the early modern period. Tune in next time as we enter the 19th century and the Age of Revolution. Special thanks to my patrons, including my Nevi'im, Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, Sergei Gerasimov, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Eric Liederman, and JP Strathausen.